Hey, we want to welcome everyone to the second evening of a dialogue on racial injustice, and I really appreciate everyone who's joining online. And I want to begin with a quick word about the technical nature of creating this kind of a dialogue and doing so live. We're in the midst of a significant work at our facility that's bringing an upgrade to both our sanctuary space and our online live stream experience as well. So the timing of this event required setting up a temporary space in our gallery to provide something we believe is really more natural than a recorded Zoom call. And that's required far more than any of us could imagine. Creating a live event is complicated and involves technical limits that we know involves patience for everyone. So I want to give a shout out to the enormous work that Jonathan, Savannah, and Joel have put into this. And I want those who are part of the Westside Vineyard community to know that some great work is going on in the background to invest in our future of gathering both in person and online. Now to reintroduce our dialogue on racial injustice. This is the second of two evenings of dialogue, and if you weren't able to join on Tuesday, the first evening is up on our YouTube channel, and I want to encourage you to take the time to view that first part of our discussion with friends Jeff and Ashley and Dr. Ken McGill. And for those who were a part of that first evening, I want to say welcome back and note that I want to repeat a few of the underlying elements of the conversation because the nature of dialogue itself is so important. This past Sunday, I was reminded that Jesus spoke to us about relationships and reconciliation. And he said, as you recall, if you're on your way to the altar to bring your gift to God and you realize that someone may have something against you, stop and go to them immediately and seek to be reconciled. And as I said the other night, we do well to realize who he's speaking to. He's speaking to those who presume that they're prepared to worship God, that they could come rightly before God. And he's saying, as much as that might be the first commandment to love God, don't attempt to worship him unless you're prepared to love others. And he says you need to stop and consider your relationship with others. And this means actually caring about what another's experience, which means stopping to consider if we've created genuine space that seeks to understand. And that may be the hardest part of a dialogue. It's hard to have space for understanding if that space is already full and settled. We all have what we could call like narratives. That's our understanding of the way things are. And we can form narratives that are so locked down that we don't leave space for inconvenient elements that don't fit. And some of us may do well to be honest about our capacity to listen. We all have some form of narrative, some way of understanding the way things are, and we do well to realize that we will only grow closer to the truth when we can grow to include what really makes sense of the real experience that others have. So we have to keep our narratives open. And it's in this way that dialogue can help us to become, I'd like to say, bigger people whose narratives, whose way of seeing the world gets bigger, and we become better for it. Today I read some words that somebody had shared. They shared about growing up in a school that was very multicultural, and there was a lot of cultural learning, but they realized that they still faced, these years later, a lot to learn. And I want to share what they wrote. She wrote, "This has been a time for a lot of reflection. One thing I've learned in listening to so many speak out is that there are certain things I've taken for granted. Although many times I have felt shy, awkward, or out of place, I've never felt feared. I've never felt that way, the way that I was scary to a stranger riding in an elevator with me, or suspicious to a store owner or police officer. I've always felt the fairness of laws and rules. Many white people I know, like me, feel the same way, but this is not everyone's reality. I've been surprised at how every single person of color, no matter their economic status or life accomplishments, have shared story after story of examples I can't relate to. things that have just never happened to me. There are so many nuances and scenarios in politics to muddle things up or try to pit us against each other, but I hope there is more understanding and listening and conversations happening in the white community. I pray we all end up more united together than divided apart, that Black lives matter to everyone so that all lives matter. Those are great words, and it's in that spirit that we're glad to provide an opportunity for a little bit more dialogue. And what we hope simply keeps opening up the space inside of us. As I shared on the first evening, I know that it's really, that we want to provide a good sense of what that conversation can be. So let me quickly clarify three things that about those who are sharing. Number one, they are not in this dialogue because they want to be, but because they're willing to be. There's a lifetime of personal feelings that none of us really want to always have to return to or give our focus back to, and to do so is hard. To be asked to share them with a friend is really hard. To be asked to share them with people that we don't really even know, that's almost beyond us, especially when so many things are stirred up. So I just want to say how much I appreciate that willingness, and I hope and trust you will too. Secondly, they're not here to speak for all Blacks. They're only here to share something about their personal experience, not speak for others. And thirdly, they're not here to debate, but to share. I understand that it can be difficult to separate personal dialogue from the debate on various views and policies from any discussion, but this dialogue is primarily about personal experience and perspective. And I want to note that everyone can add to this dialogue by sharing questions or comments during our live time together right now. And we encourage you all throughout the night, if you have any questions or comments, to follow the instructions on the screen. You can simply text the word chat to 55444. And then towards the end of the night, we're going to conclude with a bit of time for live questions and answer time. We may not be able to get to all of the questions due to time, but we'll do our best. And if some seem less about personal experience but helpful to comment on, then I may address those as well. So with that, welcome. And I want to introduce you to friends Greg and Kimberly, and invite them is the best way to get started, just to introduce themselves by way of the brevity of sharing a little bit, the touch bases, the references of your lives. And
you want to start or you want me to? Well, you know, my name is Gregory, or Greg. I am 50 plus years of age.
That's very safe.
I've passed the double nickel. I'm on my way onto the speed limit next, you know, the freeway one. I've lived in California since basically I was 3, I believe. So I count myself as a native Angelino because I've lived pretty much in Los Angeles or in the adjacent county of Orange County all of my life. I grew up, my early part was growing up in the city of Los Angeles. I actually went to Crozier Junior High School, and then my father was able to got a house out in Walnut, which is east of here, out by Pomona, next to Diamond Bar. And I went to college out to Mount Sac and Cal Poly Pomona, and then ended up working for Southern California Gas Company. And so I lived in Orange County and then back here in the city afterwards. So I've been here since, it's been a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to have you share, and then I want to hear how you guys met too, because I don't recall.
Oh.
So, oh boy, wait.
So, yeah, I grew up in LA, grew up in Compton, and about 6th grade, I think my mom moved us out to Covina for better education, and we lived out there until I graduated, and then I went to school in San Diego and came back to LA, graduated from there, and I ended up working at, I don't know if we're supposed to use names, large metropolitan hospital, I'll just say. And I ended up going to Nurse Midwifery School, and I worked there pretty much the whole time. And I'm the chief nurse midwife there, and I love what I do. And we didn't talk about, well, we'll talk about that.
So you both have been in your careers and working for the same for a lot of years.
31 years from now.
Wow, wow.
Yeah, 20, yeah,
Wow.
30 this year.
So you went to high school in Covina, then college in San Diego?
Right.
Where'd you go to school in San Diego?
UCSD.
Okay.
Well, actually, every school there, but
Okay, yeah, that's where you ended. Yeah, spread it out. And so where in this did you guys meet, and anything about where your own faith growing up and how you found your way to the Vineyard?
So when I was going to the JC, which was Mount San Antonio,
Yeah.
I met a young lady, Robin G. at the time, and Robin was Kimberly's best friend,
Okay.
and she introduced us to each other.
Mhm.
Now, Kimberly didn't like me at the time because she already had a boyfriend.
Oh, but you proved to be the greater choice.
A much better
Much
boyfriend.
better. Yes. So we've been married for about 20 years now, and we have 2 girls, Kayla and Zoe. Kayla's out in Portland, and Zoe's still with us. She's getting ready to go off to college, so very proud of both of them.
Mm.
Yeah.
And in terms of, have you both been followers of Jesus a long time, or did that come later? And how did you find yourself over here with the?
I was mostly
Bless.
raised Catholic, and then when I met Robin, our friend, I started going to the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal, and I did that for probably somewhere close to 15, 20 years. And then after Kimberly and I got married, and the AME Church was a long ways away, and then we were looking for churches, and Kim's sister, Cassandra, was attending here, and so she said, why don't you try this one instead of getting in the car and driving many, many miles every Sunday.
Yeah.
So we're looking for a place where our girls could be, could learn and be exposed to Jesus and have a good Christian upbringing. I used to say that the problem with and I don't mean to offend Catholics because I always call myself a Reformed Catholic, but at the particular church we went to, they used to almost, when service was over, because it's only a 45-minute service, that people were in such a hurry to get out for the next service that you could almost get hit in the parking lot. And I always thought that wasn't really showing the love of. I went, so that should be enough. And I don't mean to offend Catholics, please. Forgive me.
Well, we're blessed to have the girls, and Zoe is a very special part of the family here in so many ways, and so, and I like how she chimed in with us the other night. So she's in many ways in this conversation because she's also part of what and we talked about how you go through what does it mean to have to work through racial injustice, not only for yourselves, but for those lives that you care for. And so that's a part of the conversation, and I hope others can appreciate that as well. So with that, I want to invite you, whoever and however you want to share some of your experiences. And again, I have used the big term racial injustice, racial prejudice, lots of ways, didn't I? But I mentioned that there's more than one element to that, and everybody's minds might go to one because things are focused on this incident or that. But I know there are multiple ones, and one aspect of that can be the boundaries and discrimination, and that can be systemic, but it can be personal. Any way that one feels kept out in some way, from relationships, from anything else. There also can be just the suspicions and fears that we're all aware of, where somebody is projecting some undue suspicion and relating to us in a certain way. And then there can just be the social assumptions that get made, and that sometimes are nothing more than just kind of an awkwardness, but they can be still difficult, and for sure. And so, in terms of any of those, can you share would you be willing to share some of your experience?
Kimberly?
You go.
I was thinking about the talk on Tuesday that Jeff had, and I was thinking about when I was at Cal Poly Pomona. I was an engineering student, and there was a young lady that I liked, and she was Filipino. And I said, I thought we were, I was trying to date her, and I thought we were hitting it off pretty well. And she told me, she says, I like you a lot, but I can't bring home a black guy. And I was thinking, you're darker than I am. And she said, well, I could bring home a Filipino guy, I could bring home a white guy, but my mom would lose it if I brought home a black guy, And I just kind of like, wow, I thought what really mattered was the person that I am, not the color of my skin. I've seen or been had other racial prejudices before, but I thought, okay, that might be with women who are white, but not a Filipino or a Latino. You know what I'm saying? It didn't make any sense to me, especially if they were already as my color or darker. I didn't know why that would be a problem.
Yeah.
So those kind of things still were going on, at the time, and that would have been in the 80s and 90s. Anything?
Yeah, of course, now I'm completely blank. But I think what I would want to share right now, that's right there at the top of my head, is an experience that actually my mom had as a nurse. She's a nurse, and actually I have two sisters that are nurses, and my mom is a nurse, and I'm a nurse. We got lots of nurses. It was interesting that as she was, as she shares the story of her coming through as a nurse, how difficult it was for her, how many blockages that she had to get through in order to get to where she ultimately made it to as a director. But even as they didn't let her into nursing school because she was black, and then they told her it was because she was too young, so she waited a year, and they came back and they were like, well, really, it's because you're black, so we can't let you in. So she had to find another school, and she would try to get positions as a charge nurse, and there was, someone would take her aside and say, I know you want this position, but they're not going to hire you because you're black. And she's like, well, what am I supposed to do? It's like, okay, so you're telling me.
At this point, there's almost this unspoken, so she's, giving her heart energy.
Exactly.
And then it's on the side, it's just, you're not going to be.
It's just not going to happen. So she keeps having to reverse, go around, and do it another way. And so she finally was able to get to a position where she was able to, because you couldn't move forward unless you had a supervisory job, and they wouldn't give her a supervisory job. So she had to kind of like go around the way. She had to get a master's. She had to get, like way more than what she would than anybody else would have had. And when she finally interviewed for this particular position, she was able. The only reason why they hired her is there was a medicine side, an administrative side, and the nursing side. The nursing side did not want her, but the administrative and the medicine side did. So they outvoted them, and they had to hire her. But because they did not want her, they pretty much put her at a per diem, like not even a full-time position in the position that she was doing, even though she was
not to offer the security that most people would have.
She didn't even know this. She was completely unaware that they had done this. They intentionally put her not on a real item. They put her on a per diem item, which was paid less, and that's where she worked until she retired. And she didn't find this out until like several years later. And the only reason why that happened was because she was black, and they didn't want to hire her. So it's the reason why I bring that story up is because it shows how systemic racial bias can be, and how it could stop you in so many different levels. I feel like me personally, I did not have that many obstacles to become a nurse. Thankfully, I had a lot more opportunities. Not to say that I didn't have any opportunities to be discriminated against, but not as much as my mom, and she was able to, kind of overcome those things. but it could be anywhere. That's the thing. It's like it could be in a personal level, it could be in a systemic level, it could be you're blocked from a position, or you're blocked from a house that you want to move into because they've decided that blacks can't move into that area, or education. You're not able to get access to education and things like that. It was funny because Zoe and I were having this conversation where we were talking about what is our privilege? Like, what is our, how is it that we actually see ourselves as having privilege? And one of the things that she was able to identify was that she came from a two-parent home. She's had access to education. She has access to healthcare. All of those things give you a privilege that a lot of people don't have. And it's not necessarily because you're black or you're white or you're Hispanic or whatever. For whatever reason, people have different levels of privilege. And I think that what makes it challenging is that when people aren't aware of their privilege, it's kind of like a thing that it's like being in like a fish in water. You just automatically have it, so you don't really think about it. So I feel like
everything might look equal, and that everybody's having the same experience,
because
but they're not.
Because you
And-
can't see what the other people are getting. And when Kim said that, it reminded me of so my dad moved us out of the city to go to a better school. That was the reason we moved out there. And when I left Crozier, we were in between we were just finishing up the 7th grade, going into the 8th grade. And at Crozier, they were teaching us the beginning parts of algebra. So we were starting this, and they say that we want to get you ready for what's coming up in high school and get you on the college track. And so when I went to the middle school in Walnut, they said, well, I need you to test. And I didn't test so well. And they put me back in remedial math. And the difference was both my parents were working, so they didn't realize that I had fallen behind. And so then once you get labeled as remedial math, then we're going to put you in the workshops. So we used to have electrical workshop. We used to have the wooden workshop. They taught us all the skills to make sure that you would be a nice...
Kind of setting you back from
so
what
you're
you're going,
nice
but
blue-collar,
opportunities
yes.
will be ahead.
Yeah, and so then and so you don't realize those things that are set up. And I would say some of the times the teachers just thought, well, I'm helping him out. I'm giving him a good trade so that he'll be able to work. Not that he's reaching for whatever he can be. It's better you realize it's better for a person to strive to be the most they can. And even if they failed, at least they were on their way to something they really wanted.
Yeah.
And it took me a long time, and I'll say Zoe. Zoe's into music. Okay. And I am so proud of her, and she's talented, and it scares me to death. And because I'm thinking, well, she's a nurse, she'll have a job. But that's not her passion.
You know that feeling, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I want her to, but the truth is, as a parent, if she achieves whatever she wants, or she goes for her goals and she can take care of herself, that should be all that I really ask. And that said, that the school system or the system out there should help support each and every last person to achieve the best that they want to be, whatever it is, and not have someone say, well, I really don't think you have it, and because you don't fit into the mold of what I think it should look like, and so I think that's the hardest thing, and it doesn't fall, like I said, to me it's not just a policeman, it's not just the teacher, it's the whole kind of thing. Kimberly talked about not moving into the neighborhood you wanted to, but they know what I mean by that. I'm talking about the banks or the people who do the loans. They have an idea of who you are. And, this little piece of mail, I'll be quick. This little piece of mail came from my sister. She used to live at our address. We have 2 houses. And she lived there 20 years ago. And it was from one of the large banks. And the bank was saying, we accidentally charged you a fee for insurance on that car that you had. And because of the class action lawsuit, we need to pay back that money, that fee that we charged onto your car loan. And so we'll be glad to give it to you, but what we need is the proof that you paid insurance on that vehicle 20 years ago. And my sister is saying, you know, I know what car it was, but I've had 3 cars since then. I've gone to 2 different, you know, institutions and different insurance. So how would I get that? And so they want to give her the money. But the question is, can you even drive a car in the state of California without it being without insurance? Because the registration will get pulled the moment you do, you know? And so they didn't do it to everybody, but in my zip code, which happens to be predominantly African American and Latino, I'm pretty sure I can get away with it, you know? And that particular bank has done multiple things. And so I say that sometimes those things are institutionalized.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of talk I was just hearing last night about ways in which people are paying more insurance, more on mortgages, various things because of the way a lot of things are structured as such. You mentioned your parents, and do you either both of you have a sense that you're kind of aware of your parents carrying kind of their own fears, their own feeling constrained, any of that?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I think it would. My father's passed away since, but when we were younger, he used to come home so angry, and we just thought he was always an angry person. But I don't think he was angry at us. He was never angry at us, but he was just tired and angry. And I think because where he worked and it required, and he would always say that you always have to double check because they're out to get the proof that he's not qualified for the position he was. He used to work for one of the defense contractors, and he was a quality inspector. In fact, he was a supervisor of the quality inspectors, and he would come up with new ways to help them be more efficient and double check to make sure the quality was meeting the goals. Because he was always talking about how it was important because of the stuff that they built was for the defense of the country, and so he took great pride in that. But he always wanted to make sure that whatever product that he was responsible for was the best product that he could get out. And he would talk about how it was later that he talked about how hard it was because, you know, people say, well, you know, you're not really qualified, you're not really smart enough, and he was a really smart guy, and he used to always say, they pay me for what I know, not for what I do, because he was pretty smart.
But he felt like he was having to work extra hard and be extra under suspicion or a little less secure.
He was, yes. And so when that particular defense contractor was absorbed into another one, because there's only a few now, he was trying to get another job. And they said, well, we'll help you. We'll help you get to another, you know, because we're being bought out. We know there's a space for you. And there wasn't, you know, somebody else, you know, I guess when they're saving people off the boat, you decide who you save and who you don't save.
Yeah.
So, no.
Other ways that and other experiences that you've had in terms of how you felt related to, treated?
I think that a lot of the time it's almost like when you're working or when you're in school or when you're trying to, you know, move to the next level, it always feels like you're not quite making it or you're not quite, you know, meeting the expectations. So you feel like you have to do extra and above and beyond, but there's always that nagging. A lot of what I've experienced has not been overt. You know, nobody has, you know, called me out of my name or anything, but it was just very subtle ways of, I remember when Greg was talking about how when they did the math test, it was so funny because almost the same thing happened to me when I switched from Compton to Covina. I don't even think they tested me. I think they just automatically put me in remedial. They just, instantaneous. And my mom was kind of like, she was like, well, what's going on?
Yeah.
And how is this going on? And
I feel like she needed to advocate.
exactly. And it was almost like she had to like force them to test me so that they could see where I actually, and I ended up being, beyond what they thought that I was.
But without somebody speaking up.
Exactly. I wouldn't have,
Yeah.
I certainly wasn't going to ask for more work, but,
Yeah.
but,
Darn it.
yeah.
Got
So
it.
you constantly, but it's almost like, especially moving from, predominantly black school to a predominantly white school, it was like things were always pointed out that things were different and you knew that you weren't like everybody else. And why does your hair do that? And
Yeah.
what is, it was just, it was just like, you're just like other.
Yeah. You shared something about, it was something you faced, but I think you were with Greg, but stopping to help somebody and how that was an example of just the kind of inner caution you have to live with, just what normally would be your flow of compassion, but you had to have a check. Can you share a little bit about that?
I believe it was a Saturday morning, and Kim calls me the busybody of the neighborhood. We live on not a major street, but it's not a small residential. It's pretty good size. And there was a car that broke down, so he was double parked across the street. And they had gotten out and they were trying to get the car started and do something. And then there were two of them, and I'm watching them through my dining room window, and I'm like, I think they need help, but I'm not sure. And they were doing it, and it just didn't look like they were trying to jump the car. And I said, well, I've got the quick jumper that I can go over there real quick.
Yeah.
And then I said, but they were not African Americans, and I thought they might be worried to see a black guy coming out of his house, walking across the street, and I was only going to help. And so sometimes you have to think about what you're going to do, how you're going to, if you can help people, So, and I'm not a mechanic, so I figured at some point the two of them probably know how to do it. They're grown men, and even though I want to help, it's not what I probably could do. I mean, I could do it, but it might not be one of the things I should do.
Yeah.
And I don't think, I'm not sure if people always have that thought.
But the fact that you have to think, how will I be deemed or
I think as
presumed
an
to be
African American male, you have to think about that all the time. And I don't think people think about how often you have to think about it. It was funny because I was looking at, because it's COVID-19, I was thinking about buying some different face masks, or not face masks, but different covering.
Yeah.
And I looked at the, I don't know, it's like I think it was a coffee, I don't know, it's like a mask that a scarf that you would wear if you were Palestinian or from the Middle East.
Yeah.
Where I go sometimes, when I'm just out, if my hair is cut, I'm often asked, where am I from? And I'm not the regular American black. Sometimes I become even a foreign black.
Right.
And that's scary. And if I'm
But you can tell people are trying to
Yes.
figure out how to perceive who you are.
And it's hard. So people
with
always
fear.
ask, where are you from?
Yeah.
And sometimes they're asking, not am I from LA, but what country am I from?
Yeah. Yeah.
I get that more times than you might imagine. If my beard is down and my hair is cut, they're always, I get this question, where are you from? And I say, oh, I'm from here. No. Where are you from? And the answer is, I've been here longer than most. African Americans have been here since just after the Pilgrims got here. That's how long they've been importing Africans into this country. And people think, well, my people came on the Mayflower. I mean, on the, from Ireland.
Yeah.
We were already here.
Yeah.
And when you think about where you're from, I can't tell you where I'm from because I think African Americans will tell you they came from Africa. Africa is a continent. It's like saying I come from Europe.
Yeah.
Well, are you Polish? Are you Italian? Are you
Yeah.
French? Are you German? Are you Sweden? It's a vast, and that's how Africa is. And people say, well, I don't understand how you don't know where you're from. And that means they don't understand what that dark part of the United States history was. And I think I saw that HBO Max took Gone with the Wind off because they said they needed to put in context before you watch it because it romanticizes that time period. And it wasn't pleasant. And I heard a guy say, well, it really couldn't have been that bad because, they wouldn't have abused their property like that. And, the question is, if you had to work 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day, you didn't get paid. You fed what you were fed, but if they wanted to, they could sell your wife and your kids. I don't think anybody's going to sign up for that. And you say, well, why didn't they run away? Because they couldn't. If you ran away, they beat you. And if you did, when you got to be no more use, what good were you? And so it's like selling an old horse. The old horse is going somewhere. We don't want to talk about where old horses go, but old slaves went somewhere too, and they would take them and, I need that big male with this big female, and we'll get bigger people, and then they can pull a horse is only so much, and a man or a woman can do a whole lot more. And I don't think Americans think about that because it's something ugly in their closet. And you have to get the skeletons out. You have to face that.
Yeah.
And if people don't, and we just keep pretending, it's like it's a cancer. I think that's what it is. And people say you can live with. Nobody wants to live with a cancer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry.
And I presume that it has no effect.
Yeah.
You. So I wanted to ask you, what have you guys been feeling over the last 2 weeks? As all of this has been kind of raising up the reality of inequality and injustice, and what have you been feeling? Not that a lot of it I know is things we're trying to figure out, even what we feel amongst the many, and can't fully explain all that. So I don't presume that, but just if you could.
You want me to go? I think frustration is probably the biggest thing. A lot of frustration that it's like, again, another one, another person brutally killed by police in another city. It was like back to back to back to back. There have been several instances over the years that have been brought up, but it was like all at the same time.
And when those take place, how do you experience that?
It feels like it's almost like it's almost like if you have like a bruise, if you have a bruise on your arm or something, and
It's tender.
it's just kind of tender and it's kind of there, and it's like you just kind of deal with it. That's like the simmer of the issues with race that constantly follow you all day, every day. And then when something like that happens, it's like somebody slams a hammer on that bruise, and it causes an even bigger bruise and causes even more pain. The frustration that the police would continue to treat African American males in such a way that they're not even considered people. They're, it's just with such nonchalance and such cavalierness, and it's almost like they know that they're going to get away with it, and they do many times. Hopefully, not all the time.
Yeah.
But it just kind of brings to the forefront that this is an issue that we're constantly dealing with.
Yeah.
I think for a long time it felt like things were kind of like, I don't even want to say calming down, but it wasn't in the forefront. Even for me, I felt like you were just kind of like just doing your day-to-day. We were more thinking about the COVID-19 and trying to not get sick, and not so focused on, racial injustice per se, even though it's something that it's always there.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that once this happened, it kind of brought it to the forefront again, that this is something that we're constantly dealing with, and something that is not going to be dealt with easily, and it seems like it's impossible. It feels impossible sometimes.
Yeah. For you,
I would agree with her. It was the frustration. It was anger, but not much. It was just a frustration, a weariness, and then it was
Lots of
just a great sadness and being tired. It was like, I'm just too tired. I don't want to keep doing this anymore. I don't know why it keeps happening. It's not that I'm doing anything. And what I mean by that is like, it doesn't necessarily, you don't have to necessarily be doing something wrong for that to happen to you. And I know people will say, well, he had a $20 bill that was fake or counterfeit. And I've seen counterfeit 20s myself. I don't print them up, but sometimes when you get a bunch of money from some places, you'd end up with a funny dollar bill, and you're just like, it happens. And I'm not saying that was right, but I was thinking about, I didn't tell you this story the other day, so let me tell you a story real quick. Kimberly and I always take the girls on winter trips. We have 2 vacations a year. And so we used to take the kids skiing. And so this particular year we were going up to, in Utah, what was it? Brian Head? Brian Head. And so we have a timeshare that we were going to stay in Vegas, because Brian Head is probably 10 or 12 hours up, and Vegas is 6, and you could just do the other 4. And so we were all excited, and our trip was supposed to start January the 2nd, I think it was. And we were driving we had a minivan at the time, and we were busy getting everything ready because of the holidays and everything, and we didn't realize that the tags were expiring in January. I mean, there was December of that year, and they would be ready for the following year. Yeah. So I take the car to, I take the registration to AAA, and they say, oh, you need it smogged. But I paid for the registration, but she said, go get it smogged and come on back and we'll give you your tags. Yeah. So I take it to get it smogged, and the catalytic converter was bad, so it wouldn't pass. So we're there, and I said, well, we have the paperwork showing that we paid the registration. And so I said, well, we could rent a car or we just take this one. I said, well, we've already paid the registration. If somebody asks, we can show them the registration. And so we go to Vegas, and I think we'd gone out to dinner that night, and we're going back to the timeshare because we're going to go the next morning up to Brian Head, and we get pulled over from the highway patrol in Nevada. And he says, do you know why I pulled you over? And I said, no, sir, I don't know why you pulled me over. He says, I pulled you over because of the registration on your car is expired. And I said, we actually paid for it, and I had Kim open the compartment, and when the police pull up, what you do is, this is a trick, so you roll all the windows down so that they can see all the way in the car and make the policeman feel more at home. And so...
Which, by the way, you just said, I would not feel the same.
Yeah, it
Need
doesn't
to
matter
do
if it's
that.
snowing.
Yeah.
You roll
Yeah.
down all the windows and you keep your hands on the steering wheel and you tell the kids to be still because if he sees movement, he might get nervous and shoot somebody accidentally. And so so I show him the registration that I paid for it from, and he says, I said, well, it didn't pass smog, so I couldn't get the tags. And so he says, you can get it smogged here in Nevada. And I calmly said, I didn't know I could get a California vehicle smogged in Nevada. You can't. And he says, I actually could impound your car, take you to jail, and leave your family on the side of the road. So we're on a side road in Vegas off the Highway 15, coming off one of those transitions, and he says, I can take you to jail, and I will leave your wife and kids here on the side of the road, and I will have your car impounded. For what reason? Everyone else who has a car that is the registration expired in December and it's January the 4th, I'm pretty sure at most they get a ticket.
Yeah.
Or sometimes they say, all right, take care of it. I see that you've already get on your way.
So what did he end up?
He gave me a ticket. I said, I'll take.
Okay.
He gave me the ticket, and I remember I told my wife, I will not come back to this godforsaken city for 10 years.
Yeah.
It was 9 years before I had to go back.
Yeah. Yeah. You could feel that. We're going to pick up a little bit more with this conversation.
Have a commercial
But
break?
we are going to take
A commercial break.
not a commercial break. We're going to share with you now a segment that took place just prior to this with Dr. Prince Parker. And so we welcome you all to watch this. So we're really privileged to be able to gather around this moment together. And we thought it would be really valuable part of this dialogue on racial injustice to have some conversation that we've pre-recorded here just for the sake of how things were working out, to be able to engage this perhaps a little bit more uniquely because of the extent of their lives and because of being in pastoral ministry for so long. So with that, welcome.
Thank you.
And as I shared with you, I know that your experiences with racial injustice and diversity are so unique, spanning time, but cultures, and few stories like yours. And I thought, while you can't even begin to expound on that experience, it would be helpful just to hear what things might stand out to you as highlights, as those moments that become very unveiling, perhaps, on where we are as people.
As for here in the United States, I was born here in the States, but when I woke up, I was in Europe and came into my own in Europe and in Germany.
Because why? How was that?
Oh, it was my father's career. He was a liaison from the DOD and different parts, and a lot of his stuff was classified. So don't really know. It was in the Department of Defense under the Department of the Army, and so but we lived in France and in Germany and the UK and Switzerland, and I just remember that, and I loved it. It was just life, but in the early 60s, my family came back to the States, and that was right in the middle of the civil rights crisis. Mm-hmm. And being that my family was well-to-do, my family has a rich history that goes back quite some time. On my father's family, they were the founders of the first all-black law school, which is now Howard University School of Law. They started that and created that, and that goes back a ways. And so like we were able to buy a house, nice house anyway.
How old are you at this point when you're?
I was in elementary school, so I was about 4th, 5th grade and whatnot. And so when we came back, we couldn't buy a house just anywhere. We were redlined and had to buy a house in the black neighborhood. But President Kennedy was trying to integrate the schools, and so I was chosen, and one other young man was chosen from our neighborhood to go to an all-white school. It was much farther, and so there were only about 3 or 4, I can remember, four black students in that whole school. We were not
And
one
this is,
of them.
and you're realizing this is a very new experience for a lot of people.
For them, it wasn't for me. I grew up in Europe. You know?
Yeah.
So me going in there with innocence, just it's fine. I wasn't prepared for some of the very negative. I couldn't understand why some of the very negative treatment that I was receiving, and I'd come home and this happened, and the teacher did this and that and that. My parents, I remember seeing sad looks on my parents' face, but they never really tried to explain. There's too much history for that to try to explain that to a kid. But now I know what it was. And sitting in your class all day long with your hand up, you don't understand anything and nothing, or like, try this. I'm a baby boomer, so on Valentine's Day, the teachers used to say, okay, you draw a name out of a hat and you're gonna give this person, that's gonna be your secret Valentine. So when the person would go home and show and they say, this is a black kid, the parents would write on the thing, it happened more than once. And instead of putting Prince Parker, they would put Dense Darker, and that's the card I would get, And so just stuff, those are minor things, but that makes you, okay, And
you're becoming more and more aware of this now as you're heading in through these.
Yeah, but it's still not my problem because I took a look at it. It's okay. It's not my problem because I'm used to being around white people, and I had some friends, but it was them that weren't used to being around me, and so and I discovered that the average American rarely has comfortably people in their house of another race. They'll have visitors occasionally now, but there are people that have never had a white person in their house or never had a black person in their house. They might know them, and it's getting rarer and rarer. But there are pockets of America. Yes, that's a reality, and so I was the intruder, so to speak. And so you're going to experience things. And then when I came to junior high school, when I came to the States, I had a British accent. And so that was just weird. You got a black guy with a British accent in your school. And so so when I go back to where we were redlined, I'd get punked and beat up by the fact, you talk funny, you walk funny, And so to me, the whole world was a creep, The whole world was just whacked.
Fitting in was just hard.
No, I didn't, and I didn't care to, And so I found comfort in books, and I had a chemistry set. They called me Spock or the mad scientist, the absent-minded professor, and I didn't mind. But going into junior high school, boy, I was the bully. For the blacks, I was too white. For the whites, I was black. And so I was just getting sick of the world. So I went to a parochial school, the Springs in the church. I thought, well, maybe Christians. I didn't know anything about Christianity. My family wasn't Christian. My dad was kind of disillusioned with Christianity, so he was experimenting with Islam then, So all of our house was done in Islamic inventory and stuff like that, because he spent a lot of time in the Middle East. And so I thought, okay, maybe if I go to a religious school, maybe religious people will have a better attitude. Oh, that went south. We're on the Monterey Peninsula. It's very, I was in the very same school group that Patty Hearst was in. She was, and she was there, and there were several other, very wealthy people from that area. And I had kids following me around campus all day long. Nigger, what are you here for? Excuse me, the frankness, but that was the reality.
Yeah.
And stuff. I had 2 kids that were raised in Germany. One was a Spanish German. His name was Miguel Hernandez, Mike Hernandez. and he's from Germany. I did know him in Germany, though. We went to the same school in an area. I didn't pay attention.
Yeah.
But now that we're in this school together, in this Catholic school, we just became fast friends. And there was another
But
German.
you had familiarity with each other.
Yeah, we had. So we
Yeah.
just clung. To this day, we are best friends.
Wow.
We are best friends. As a matter of fact, he was the first person I led to Christ.
Wow.
When I became a Christian. And then there was Olaf Crocker. These two guys, they were. I don't know where Olaf is today, but I do know where Mike is. So, so they just kind of like became my right hand and left hand, my wingmen, and followed me around. I've always been a pacifist, but one day this kid, I remember what his name is, I can tell his name, and he was from a well-to-do family. His family had restaurants on the wharf and on the pier there, and everything. Their name was up, and he was calling me around, and they just couldn't get over it. What are you doing here? And that. When I say I've always been a pacifist, I mean always. I mean I get punched out and I would never return. I just no, I don't. That's not what I want in life. But at that moment, I turned around and I don't even know how I did it, but I kicked this young man in his mouth. I turned around and that was like a taekwondo move. I'd never studied anything. I kicked him. I split his top and his bottom lip. And I thought, I have dehumanized myself. So I said to Mike and Olaf, I said, take me to the office. I'm out of here. And by that time, I'd been growing my hair long since about 66. So I was kind of like, I was checking out. And so when I got to the public high school, the freaks, that's what we called each other back then, the freaks, they received me. They said, hey, come on over. And apart from that, I was a musician. So like I didn't know it, but I just kind of fit right in. Having a name Prince, growing up with a name Prince back in the 60s, it was like they only named your dog Prince. And here, Prince, and stuff like that. And so there was that.
Yeah.
And so here I am with about several years of hair. It looked like a Hendrix thing, an electric head. And,
So now you've got this unique new fit, but it's not
and
totally
so like,
a fit.
oh, yeah, what a righteous handle. Shut up. Prince, oh, wow, what a name. That was the thing, and then, but that almost cost me my soul. Thank God that at a young age, I had an encounter with Christ. And that was with the Jesus people there,
Yeah.
And the church is now Calvary Chapel, Monterey,
Yeah.
And so I was saved in a white congregation and stuff, and I was blessed. I was at home,
Yeah. You have. I heard you share, and it was so helpful to have you describe how you see as America as not just one experience, and the assumption that we all have the same experience of it. It may have the same ideals, but the experience has been one that's actually been quite different. And you speak of two Americas in that way, and of course we all know that there's a lot more than that. But in terms of the experience of the primary white culture and the black culture and that experience, can you touch on a few of the things that you found helpful in recognizing that, and how it's significant?
There are even two interpretations of the same ideals, because the history of this country openly tells us that the fighting for our liberty in the Revolutionary War wasn't for my liberty. George Washington was a slave owner. Francis Scott Key was a slave owner, and a majority of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
So we
and the Bill of
identify
Rights.
them with freedom,
Yeah.
but we don't realize that for some people that
It didn't apply.
not. Yeah.
And then just a few years later, they signed into law. The Supreme Court signed into law the Dred Scott Act, which said that none of that applied to me as a black person. As a black American, it didn't. Not citizenship, not any of the statutes of the Bill of Rights or anything applied to me.
Yeah.
And that's our history. That's our history. And the third stanza of the Star Spangled Banner talks about killing the slaves that had
Committed treason.
and judging them for treason, that had gone over to the side of the British because the UK was offering freedom, freedom to any slave,
Emancipation, yeah.
emancipation. They offered absolute emancipation and citizenship to the UK for all of those that fought with their troops. And so the only ones that were really fighting to what we can call absolute freedom were those slaves. But our Star-Spangled Banner, it says they are worthy of death. And so I knew that from elementary school. And so I said, that's okay, I could sing that, but it's not for me. It wasn't for me. If I wanted the freedom, I would have been executed. If I'd have fought for it, my freedom. And my family has a long history. I did our genealogy, and we go back, and my family has fought in every war of this country. But coming back, there were lynching parties for African American soldiers, military soldiers. I'm talking about up until World War II, that would get off the buses, going home, wearing their military uniform. And Vietnam was one of the first wars fought with an integrated military. We're not talking about that long ago. And it wasn't until 1996 that blacks that died in gallantry on the battlefield received recognition and the Medal of Honor. We had to go all the way back to World War II to give those, give them to their survivors to grant. 1996. That's just yesterday for us.
So any sense that we can merely say that perhaps a few people far, far back, and that things got corrected quickly, you're talking centuries of
talking
not
about
having correction.
About centuries of living in two different countries. And so it wasn't until the mid-70s or early 80s that the definition of a jury of your peers included if a black man was being judged, there had to be black men, people in the jury. And that wasn't even taken up by all of the states, which is, two different countries,
Yeah.
I remember looking at TV as a kid. You never saw a black face on the TV. We were able to enjoy it because that's life. What are you going to do, And then I remember when Link came in and the Mod Squad, Link, a black face, yeah, wow, yeah. It's, it's just something, yeah. Black hero, Link, and now it's more frequent. It's still not like reality, but it's still, it's still frequent. It's more frequent now. And so those are two Americas. Commercial come on when I'm a kid. Buy a flesh tone Band-Aid. Not flesh tone, They would announce, Band-Aid would announce it like that. Flesh tone Band-Aids. Who's flesh?
Wow.
Those are things that the dominant
culture
culture never thinks about.
Yeah.
But this is our reality, our world.
Yeah. We've talked about how that when it comes to power, one of the expressions of power is who's expected to fit into the other's, systems and norms and references and all of that. And it plays a huge role. And, as you talk about our history, one of the things that I think would be helpful for us, and we can't even begin because we can't go very far along these lines, but I think it's part of our hearts as two pastors who have been leading what God says is really his new people, his movement, the church, and all of its local expressions of that, and all the people who have given their lives to be a part of this movement, to have to come to the fact that this thing called the church, in some of its manifestations, it's not in the ultimate universal sense, but in some of its historical struggles, has these two dynamics. And as we've talked to know, one is we've got to face the fact that there's been this compromise and this complicity so deeply in America, perhaps more than anywhere, although elsewhere as well as the fact that there is no other greater hope. There is no other calling. The calling to restore the unity of humanity, to restore that not only did God create us as one race, but has come to fix the problem of all that separates us from God and each other in Christ. So this being reunited in Christ with God and one another-ness only exists in him. And so truly the church is the only hope of the world.
It
But
is.
you know, if we can't lose either of those. One, we become cynical if we only see the former, and we become simplistic if we only see the latter. We become idealism
Right.
in a way that never helps us to start getting some things right. So I'm just interested in how you've, you know, perhaps had to struggle with that or see that, because you look at the history of this and
I'm looking at the present history. Especially, I was so totally shocked. It was almost like, you know, walking with your brothers and sisters, and all of a sudden, you find out that everybody's been bitten by zombies, and you're surrounded by a bunch of zombies. I can't describe it. But when Obama was elected president, I saw a complete change in the attitude of brothers and sisters that I'd known since I was saved, and groups and everything. What happened? What happened to the world? I mean, just really, I mean, hearing some of their comments and their ideas and stuff, and I said, all this time, that's what you thought of me?
yeah.
Really? I mean, really, this is where we are? I said, that's
And this is by people that you would assume have, you know, a very clear commitment to God and to the scriptures, and somehow
this is
there's a
precisely what I'm
disconnect
talking
that you
about.
can't
My entire
believe.
life is the body of Christ,
Yeah.
and has been. And when I say, as you know, I'm interracially married. When I was married, interracial marriage was still illegal in 17 states. And so I discovered that many of my, you know, and this is a term that I never would use, my brothers and sisters, but I have to say white brothers and sisters. They looked at me, oh, but you're different. No, I'm just trying to be reasonable. You know, I go home and all my cousins and all my brothers and sisters, and everybody's black, you know, and they've got the black culture. I just know how to integrate. I know how to integrate into the dominant culture, you know, and a lot of my family does.
What do you see as the what do you sense about how the church needs to recognize and have the humility to recognize its history? Because if we presume that, what strikes me, if we presume that this isn't either a big deal or that, hey, we've got this clear, and you reach back and look and say, wow, how unclear could we have been at one point, it should kind of keep us sober and willing to think, you know, how to hold that and the hope in mind, you know? Because I know you love the church, and yet you've seen how one can read the scriptures really as tearing out portions of the book, if you will. And
Well, to see that even today there are Christian institutions that are still, I mean, the world they got it. That no, you can't make it illegal interracial marriage. But still, to this day, I mean, I could name the institutions, famous institutions that are against interracial relationships. And they think, oh, that's what the Word of God. No, that's not what the Word of God says. Moses was married to a black woman.
yeah,
You know?
yeah.
Moses' wife was black. And so, like, the thing is, the church should lead by example, but we've not. We're far behind. But one of the things, as you mentioned, Pastor, is that when I got married, I was shunned by my denomination. I was shunned and defrocked. In 1989, the Assemblies of God made a concerted effort to repent, because Church of God in Christ and the Assemblies started together in the Azusa Street. They started as one entity. But the headquarters of the Assemblies is in Missouri. And so then they separated, not on the basis of doctrine. Their doctrine's identical. They were one organization. They separated merely on the basis of race. And so what happened was, in 1989, I was on one of my trips from Spain, but I was ministering in Mexico. And I got a phone call from the Pacific Northwest District of the Assemblies of God in Kirkland. And they said, we want you to come up here. We'd like to meet with you. I got shunned when I got married. We got married in '76. And I flew up to Kirkland, to the Pacific Northwest headquarters of the AG, and they had their church historian there, Dr. Tannenbaum, and all of the general presbyters and everything, and they said, we know of you, and we called you up here to ask your forgiveness.
Wow.
He says, we're doing our history, and we're ashamed. We want to know if you will forgive us, and receive credentials. We want to restore your time with us. We want you just to forgive us. I have no problem. It wasn't my problem. It's not my problem. To this day, it's not my problem. It's just history. And I said, I would be honored to take those. And then they asked me something, and I said, we'd like to know if you'd like to be the general superintendent of the Black Assemblies of God. And I said, do you know how absurd that is as a follow-up question? I said, really? And I said, we're not, I can understand the Spanish district.
Yeah.
It's a linguistic barrier. Well, you're talking about starting an Assemblies of God and want me to be headed up because on the basis of race, that's not a good idea.
Yeah.
And they said, scratch that. Scratch that. I said, would you like to take a position in Springfield? And I said, I'm a field guy. Send me back to the field with your blessings, and I'm happy. I'm cool with that.
So you helped them check the fact that perhaps that was going to be more symbolic than relational, and they needed to keep relationally. It just thinking of that apology strikes me in some ways as showing both the problem and the potential. The problem that they could have allowed, like we all can. And I think as we look as people who are so committed to the scriptures and assume that we know the Bible and that we're being led by nothing but the Bible, that we realize that we are interpreting it. We're reading things. You just said Moses was married to a black woman. And that is probably a surprise to many. The question is, why is it a surprise?
Right.
Because perhaps we've somehow not read it in as quite as clearly. I mean, I think everyone gets that. You can't read it without getting the gist of a saving history. But in terms of how that redemption is worked out, how God comes upon the human race, how God looks at diversity, how God looks at culture, we can read it through ways in which we're comfortable, that fit within our way of seeing things. And for many, we don't know what to do with the fact that Moses is married to a black woman, and a lot of other elements too.
Numbers chapter 12, just in case somebody's wondering.
And just the whole, the nature of God somehow choosing the Middle East, even as a redemptive center of history, is itself a bit interesting to many of us because we neither represent that culturally. Most of the people dominating theology or thinking or interpreting the scriptures don't even live in the center of that Middle Eastern culture. And so we've all had to learn to move a little bit and to see clearly. But I think it's rarely been as striking as what the conscience of good people. And I think it's important to say that there was good people. We generally want to settle everything as just bad people, good people. And as I get older, and imagine you've gotten older, you just get to the point where it's not about good and bad people that we can label that way. But this country had people who were, in many respects, good and had well intentions, but made decisions that are absolutely remarkable to the human conscience.
Right.
And I think of, I was just reading of how it was said that the earliest churches, as they were emerging in America and making their way out, had decided that if you were both believers, that you could not own another. So two people who shared their life in Christ could not own the other. But then some began to come to faith and get baptized. So they actually wrestle through to coming to the place where they decide they have to bring into their polity, their church understanding, to make a declaration that the baptism of a slave into the faith will not mean that you have to stop owning them or provide them freedom, just to help rectify this tension. But again, it just shows how good people trying to think through, but so controlled by something else. And we all would like to say we would never have done that. That may be the most dangerous thing, is to think we would never have done that, because we all have to be aware that there are competing things for our values, our souls, and what we're willing to sacrifice. And they had a lot to sacrifice to confront the system. And with all of that, we're aware too that it's been people of faith and that have had the most to say into human history and redemption, and even into the issues of race. And from Wilberforce and the British going through their process and American process as well. And so I know that from our hearts and to those listening that, you know, a big part of where we all find ourselves, this point in history, is to become people who are willing to look at our compromise, our complicity, to become people who can weep, but become people who also know that there's no other hope. So we're going to take hold of the hope and the future and the calling. It's all we got.
I love it that you've even called for a discussion. Because in the world of psychology, they always look for denial of a problem, which is usually an indication of the problem. And so I find a lot of my white brothers and sisters are in crass denial.
Yeah.
Those that don't have contact with, or good contact with the black community. Or no, it doesn't exist. Racism. Well, in your mind, you probably you wouldn't consider yourself a racist. You're a good person, and I have nothing to say against that, because good people. But if seeing the death of Trayvon Martin and the justification of his murderer feels good to you, if John Crawford III murdered in a Walmart in the toy section, holding a toy gun that was sold right there within 3 seconds of the arrival of police, and no conviction, if that doesn't bother you, if the murder of Philando Castile, who was driving in his car and got stopped for a broken taillight with his wife and 3-year-old daughter in an open carry state, the first thing he says to the officer, "I'm a registered gun owner. I have a gun in the vehicle." And the officer asks to see the gun. When you open your glove compartment, he sees the gun and shoots you 7 times. And there is no conviction of the officer. And we see this time and time and time and again. And you still don't get it, that my life matters just as much as yours. And that if that doesn't move you, what do we have to do?
Yeah.
Martin Luther King was a peaceful protester, and he was shot in the throat.
Yeah.
He's our hero today.
Yeah.
But I listened to Christian radio every day going to work in the university, and I would hear a minister from Southern California, Dr. Stuart McBurney, voice of Americanism. He would show up on all the Christian radio stations, and I had a long, drawn-out discussion with him when he was saying Martin Luther King was of the devil, he was a communist, he wasn't good for America, and that was what the Christians thought. It took about 10 years for the Christian church to realize that Martin Luther King was a hero. Now, everybody understands it.
Yeah.
It's adorning the tombs of the prophets.
Yeah. And that, I think, captures the heart of, as you said, of dialogue. We've got to keep pressing it forward and be those people who recognize how off we can be, to keep rethinking and not let ourselves get, so settled.
This is great.
And so with that, I just want to say, because we're going to be continuing in our dialogue, as we've said throughout these 2 nights, and we'll continue to say, this is the beginning of that dialogue. If we understand it that way, we understand that we're directing ourselves forward and to keep walking in that dialogue. And I keep finding the term bigger and better, because I get struck by the fact that I think it's, if we narrow down our thinking, we get more stuck in it. If we are willing to listen and think more, and to challenge perhaps some of the things we get so settled in more, or stop having it be either or and both and more, and we can see the both, we can begin to see some things that I think are really from God, and that will help us, as it has the church, to fill the place that it has, and it is the place. It's prophetic. And so thank you for being a part of
Thank
this
you for inviting me.
conversation so much. And with that, we'll turn back. Everybody. Welcome back to our dialogue with Greg and Kimberly. At this time, we want to have an opportunity to respond to a couple of the questions that were posed through the evening. So, to you guys, we'll begin with a question. Are there any ways that you've intentionally educated and prepared your girls for facing racial injustices in their lives, both when they were young and now that they're adults?
Me? Okay, guess that's my question. I think that one of the things that kind of brought to the forefront when this new situation came up, it kind of came home of how much I needed to learn in order to prepare myself. I don't think I intentionally taught my girls about racism. I think that when things came up, we kind of dealt with it, and we kind of like guided them. I remember when Kayla was little, she came home, this was like probably preschool, and she was upset because somebody said, that she was black. And she's like, I'm not black, I'm brown. Look at my skin, it's brown. So she didn't understand what black and white and brown meant. And so, so when these things come up, you
How
kind
to
of,
interpret.
exactly. So we have to teach her, well, this is how this is, and this is how this works. I think one of the things that we did is that we kind of intentionally exposed them to as many different cultures as possible. We went to a multi-ethnic church. We tried to put them in multi-ethnic schools. We had them involved in activities that was multi-ethnic and things like that. I think that as they grew up, they were
Finding their way.
Exactly, and they would come home and we would talk about it. So I wish I would have known more myself so that I could teach them more. Now that they're adults and they're kind of finding their way in the world, it's been really challenging. It's been really challenging, and it's hard to watch them go through their challenges and see them struggle and see them hurt. I mean, it's like, it just kills me when I see that. And what can you do? You just kind of love them and kind of help them as best you can.
And I think I was thinking, because they're girls or females, they're not going to have the same problem as males. But I know that Kayla had a lot of problems when she went to school. And she was away from us, and she's in Portland, and we didn't realize that she was almost melting down in one of her, because she was what was it?
An RA.
She was an RA. And I feel bad because I don't think I had helped her get ready for what could go wrong. Because she had, as we said, always been around a wide variety of people. So then she figured, well, I can deal with anyone. But she wasn't prepared to deal with
some of what would come.
Yeah.
From people who'd come from maybe very different backgrounds.
So I think that was where we if we had to do it over again, we would probably help gird them more for that, which is going to be the battle that they have to go through every day
Yeah.
in life.
Well, they've got a lot going for them. Those two know that you are in their background. I think we have another question here. It says, hi guys, have Kim and Greg experienced any social class, rich-poor discrimination? Did anyone ever assume you were poor because you were black? Or make any other types of assumptions where you kind of realize they have no other basis perhaps for anything?
To me, it kind of escapes me because I don't think about it, and I will say that do we get discriminated? I mean, if you think about where we live in our zip code, we are probably and I tell Kim we're probably the most wealthiest people in the zip code.
Yeah.
But that may not be, because now I'm making assumptions about everybody else who lives in my neighborhood.
right.
There might be some people who make good
Change,
living in
yeah,
my neighborhood.
yeah.
So I think that does happen, but I'm not really.
I think that we probably feel like when people ask us where do we live, they and when we tell them where we live, they assume that because we live there,
Yeah.
that's probably, because it's not considered a rich area.
West Side, yeah.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
the West Side. So
Yeah.
then that must be because
Yeah.
we're poor, but it's really because Greg's grandfather built that house.
Which is amazing.
Right. So I live in a house that my grandfather built for my grandmother, which is a three-bedroom, bath and a half, kitchen, den, dining room.
Wow.
It's a nice house, and it has a back house too. And so it's like I've got all the room.
How
and,
few people ever have that?
Yeah.
Well, let me, as a last question for us, and then I'm going to share a few closing words for our time. But I know a number of people who would like to know, what do you think is helpful, perhaps what is not helpful? But what thoughts come to you as you see culture, and particularly, your white brothers and sisters who are really of good faith, trying to find their way through this, time trying to say, how can I, what is truly helpful as opposed to shallow or.
I think if you talk to people on a personal basis and get to know them and then ask questions and understand that anybody that you're going to make mistakes, and it's not intentional, and you're not coming from a place of hurtfulness. And so ask normal questions, and by that I mean, as my cousin was telling me, and she's a computer programmer, and she was working for a large company, and her coworkers, she said, well, can I ask you a question? And she said, sure, because she felt she knew the lady pretty well. And the lady said, what do you guys do with your tail? And she was shocked. She said, excuse me? She says, well, I've been told that African Americans have tails. And my cousin said, I thought this woman was educated because she's working and she's a programmer, and this moron thinks that African Americans have tails. So,
But she asked.
but she did ask.
Yeah.
So, don't ask silly questions, and know that it's going to be, it may not always be comfortable.
better to
but if you
have
have a
something that you
relationship with
can
somebody,
connect, yeah.
you can ask a question, a real question
Yeah.
that goes, and just know that it won't be easy, but if they're willing to, people are people. And so I would say, don't assume that you're going to get along well with every person of color that you meet.
Yeah.
Because there's some people of color that other people don't like, and I'm sure there's people, Caucasian people who other Caucasian people don't like, and so, or Latinos, and so people are just people. And
Yeah.
at the end of the day, if you are getting along with them because you have a common interest and you can talk about things, then you can build and go from there. You just don't say, hey, I'm gonna grab this guy in the corner and start asking him the most intimate questions about his
Right.
life, because you wouldn't want him doing that to you.
Yeah. Needs to be sincere.
I think relationship is huge. That's really helpful, and I feel like when you establish that relationship, that creates an opportunity to learn about each other. And I think that's the bottom line. You're not really trying to be friends with somebody so that you could find their deepest, darkest. You're developing rapport and
Yeah.
you're learning. I think that some of the things that would be helpful also would be for people, and this is something that I'm going to do myself, is, get knowledge, is like, learn by reading, learn by looking at podcasts, they even have, I just found out they even have classes on anti-racism. I had no idea. I feel like the worst thing people could do is to do nothing. Not reach out, not ask questions, not read books, not learn. Because, like I said, when you're in the water and you're not aware that you're in the water, it's very easy to just go on about your life and never make any changes and and the only way a change is going to be made is if we all are making that change. It's not going to be made because the African Americans are going to, or protest, or the Hispanics are going to protest.
Yeah.
Everybody has to come together, and we all have to work together
Yeah.
and recognize when racism is occurring.
Yeah.
And it's hard. Sometimes I don't even recognize racism is occurring.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's so subtle I don't even recognize it on first blush.
Yeah. Well, I think just coming back to the story of what Jesus said, it's about, going and pursuing, as you're saying. And I know as we were speaking last night, just to hear your heart for those of all racial differences and diversity, and I think especially as the dominant culture, the white culture, the European, we're those who do well to kind of, realize that there's a lot of people who feel unseen, misunderstood, and that's a barrier right there. And then that can lead to discrimination, intentionally, unintentionally, but we don't realize what we have in terms of our dominance, our pride, our power, our privilege, and so, but I appreciate that for all races. One of the things that we were talking about, and I wanted to bring home as we move towards the close of this time, is that to speak about racial injustice and these things is really to speak about a lot more people. Why this can seem like a white-black issue right now, the truth is there's a whole lot of people who feel, again, misunderstood, unseen. I remember sharing when we had been through the Rodney King verdict and the riots that fell, and I began to explore different people who were in the community. And I remember talking to one woman who's just a servant of our community, but so quiet. And I knew of Japanese descent, and I asked her anything about her story. And then she talked to me about being raised in an internment camp and what that was like. She'd never talked about that with anybody. And the shame that her family carried on, the fear she had of being Japanese in this culture, which is something many of us have learned more about. And again, we could go on and on for the stories. And much of the Latin community is wanting to maybe not be seen and create, conflict that can create hardship. So many people find themselves in different positions, and we do well. And I want to thank you guys so much for being willing to come and share and make that dialogue possible. And I say on behalf of, I know so many people who have expressed their hearts for you, for Jeff and Ashley, that there is a sincere sense of being sorry for what you've experienced and knowing that you will walk in that experience unless we, help bring those changes. And so thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to close just with a few thoughts on that are really related, I guess, to freedom. I think as we seek to be able to learn how to talk, a lot of us are feeling, a lot of people are feeling, I'm not really sure what to do. I feel pent up, uncertainty, tensions around us, maybe anger, and I'm trying to get out to protest, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it resolves something right now. We're wondering how to have a better conversation. And so I want to just close with these thoughts that come to mind. The first is freedom from perhaps finding ourselves framing everything in that either-or way of thinking. I think there's great freedom for a lot of us to be able to find the freedom to be both and people, to think in terms of both and terms. For instance, and I could again spend probably a half hour listing the ways we do that, but on this alone, people, if they have a compassion or a care for those who've suffered racial injustice, then they must not care, is the assumption, about those who had had looting and lost their businesses, and those who care about those who had their businesses suffer and perhaps their whole livelihood suffer from that. Those who care about that it just goes back and forth as if they're mutually exclusive. I don't know why compassion has to be deemed to be either or. I think there's room for us to be bigger people. If we see everything as either or, we actually will always get smaller. So let's not think in terms of reducing, but actually expanding who and what we care about. There's room for that. And there can be freedom in that for some. I think a second is that we do well to be free of presuming that we are the role to judge. I think there's very fitting that we can have critical minds, but not critical spirits. That we can judge well, but not necessarily become judgmental people who think that we have been given that role. And it just seems that in the world of social media, sometimes we do. And I think we do well to come back to the prayer of King David, a prayer that was deemed fitting and always has, but we seem to have rewritten it to say something like, "Search me, O God." No. "Search my neighbor, O God, and show me their wrong. Show me the ways in which they're stupid, and I can point that out to them. And lead them into the way that's everlasting, should they have any chance of ever getting there." That's almost the way that we seem to be following the prayer. And I think we do well to come back to "Search me, O God, and show me my heart. Show me my wicked ways. Show me where I'm anxious," which is an interesting part of that prayer because a lot of our fears and control comes from being anxious. And letting God show us maybe where we're fearful and insecure. And from there, we can be led in the way that's truly everlasting. So I think if we can move out of putting ourselves in the position of judging so quickly, we'll do well and find freedom. And lastly, I think the ultimate freedom that I think we're all facing is a freedom from cynicism. Because as we talked in the first call we all had, the idea of this is, we're here again. And it can seem to be deflating. And I know that I feel that too. And we can all find ourselves just taken over with, is anything going to change? And I think we do well to realize that while there's plenty of reasons to be maybe cynical, and there is something else that's pulling us forward. It's the calling of God. And it's really significant. And we really need to take hold of that and let it pull us forward. I think we were talking about just generationally. When I feel perhaps cynical, I think my grandparents' generation had a very different experience in terms of the way that they related in any kind of racial diversity. Great separation, very little relationship. My parents more, myself more, my children more, Zoe more. And so there's a lot of difference that is unfolding with each generation. And we need to see that and see the hope that is in that. It's notable. It's huge. And so it may be that we're kind of more like, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back at time, but there is this progress to see. And to realize that it is God pulling us forward. And we're rooted deeply in that. So I think to me, I just look at, and everything in my spirit says, God is in this. And he's moving us towards an end, a destiny, if you will. And it's us to awaken to that. And I'm so thankful that I just do not feel at any level of my being that we are mere material beings and that our greatest end is to be the survival of the fittest. That would be tragic right now to have that as my worldview. I don't think I could live into it because I don't find it true. I believe that we truly are one human race and that the end of all things is to live in that complete equality, and really we're being invited to move towards, to live into it. We don't create it. God already created it. We just got to show up and move our way towards that reality. But that's our destiny. And I want to encourage us to find freedom in knowing that we can read the end of the book. And with that, I just want to close us in prayer. We know, and we've all said, this is just the beginning of dialogue, just the beginning, but hopefully opening up a little bit more space inside of us that gets hungry to do, as you were just saying, to learn more about others and become bigger and better for it. So with that, I just want to invite us to pray. God, we thank you for that truly the more we look deep within ourselves, the more we do realize we are really at the essence of our beings, one people, each endowed with your spirit, your nature. However lost it has been, as we seek to find it, as we receive your spirit again, your spirit is always testifying that we are one people. There's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave or free. And we just receive and open our hearts to that testimony of your spirit. And pray that we might be led by it. Pray that we might see others by it. Pray that we might hear others by it. And we pray that you would lead us to be those who help change the history, the story that you're writing in this nation within our lifetimes. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for watching and joining us. God bless you.